All right, and welcome to Red Reviews with Justin Clark. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Corey, how's it going?
Not too bad. Yourself?
Pretty good, pretty good. It's getting sunny and warmer here in beautiful Indianapolis, so that's nice. I know it's been warmer for you too, I think.
Finally spring.
Yes, finally spring.
It
felt we just got ravaged through winter's asshole, and now we're just finally we're finally in spring, which is fantastic.
I said on Twitter the other day that we're in the we've finished the freezing to death every time I go outside, and now we're in the itchy eyes and runny nose season.
Bingo. The trick is you don't get those allergy things if you're on allergy meds all the time, which is yours truly.
Okay, yeah.
I take a cocktail allergy drugs every single day because I couldn't exist otherwise. Because I'm basically mildly allergic to everything. So there's like some people who are sort of really, really or deathly allergic to a couple of things.
Yep.
I'm mildly allergic to everything. So I have to.
So you just walk through life with itchy eyes and a runny nose, and
I did before I started taking medicines a few years ago. Yeah, my nose used to run all the time, and I'd get terrible like sinus headaches and stuff. And then I finally started doing more of an allergy regimen. I do the shots, but I don't make enough money to do that. It's too expensive.
Right.
Yeah. And because of what I'm allergic to, I don't know if I need more than one or not. I don't have a clue. I don't have a clue. So
I don't know enough. I don't know enough about it to give any advice for sure.
I'm not a science person. I love science. I used to always like the way that Penn and Teller described it. They're like, we describe ourselves as cheerleaders for science. Like we will pop up the pom-poms and yay, science. But I'm not, and so I have a layman's person's understanding of science, which I guess is much better from people even a couple hundred years ago. So,
yep.
So tonight we're going to be starting what will sort of be informally like a couple of episodes sort of throughout the year where we're sort of going to be talking about the Marxist Humanist tradition.
Nice.
And so tonight's book is Toward a Marxist Humanism, Essays on the Left Today by Leszak Kolakowski. So let's kind of begin the conversation with describing, what is Marxist humanism? So Marxist humanism was a subsection of Marxism that sort of developed out of the sort of failures of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. So there were a variety of different writers whose reactions to Stalinism were, trying to highlight the ways in which Stalinism had either completely perverted Marxism or wasn't even really Marxism at all. And so you have some earlier sort of versions of what would become Marxist humanism in writers like Georg Lukács, who was a Soviet politician, not a politician, but he was like a civil servant. He worked in the early Soviet government, was sort of phased out by Stalin, and had some of his writings sort of suppressed and so on. But it really comes into the fore, starting in the 1950s and 60s after the death of Stalin in 1953. So the book that we're talking about tonight, Toward a Marxist Humanism, really is a product of what was called the thaw in the 1950s and 60s of the Soviet Union. Because this book was published, I think, in 1969.
Okay.
And so the thaw is basically like the sort of the more opening up of the Soviet Union post-Stalin. And so there were a variety of different writers who were sort of directly responding to these sort of twin crises that we saw around the world. One was sort of market capitalism, the problems of the West, the sort of degradation of humanity by the capitalist system in the United States and sort of in broadly the capitalist world. And then there was also at the same time a critique of the Soviet Union and sort of authoritarian socialism, or what they called state capitalism. And those critiques kind of go hand in hand. The tradition is very similar to people who would say neither Moscow nor Washington. So it was this very open tradition that was trying to basically develop a alternative route from the two poles of, dominant political ideologies in the 20th century. And Kolakowski was a part of that tradition. So is Erich Fromm. who is my favorite of all of the Marxist humanists, and we'll be covering his book later in the year called Marx's Concept of Man, which is actually it's like an extended essay that he wrote, and then it's also collects for the first time in English Marx's philosophical and economic manuscripts of 1844, which are very crucial and kind of center to the Marxist humanist tradition. So the ideas of sort of alienation and the ideas of sort of degradation under oppressive systems, the humanist themes of Marx are really in that early period of Marx in 1844. But as Fromm will argue, they were continuous. There was a continuity between late Marx and early Marx. Because as we've talked about before, there were sort of people who viewed the early Marx work that was more humanistic and philosophical was contradictory to the sort of late, more economical and sort of strategic Marx. But in reality, those two kind of go hand in hand, and Fromm sort of makes that point.
Okay.
There were a couple other leaders of the sort of Marxist humanist movement. One was Raya Dunayevskaya, who was a Russian dissident who came to the United States and sort of founded Russian Marxist humanism in the United States.
Okay.
Her most important book on that is Marxism and Freedom, which I do have behind me, but we might do that in a future episode. And the other one is a guy named Ernst Bloch, who was another writer who wrote a book on Marx, but he also wrote a 3-volume book series called On the Principle of Hope.
Okay.
So Marxist humanism, in its essence, is trying to get back to the roots of what Marx was trying to articulate to the world.
Right.
Which is that the system of capitalism alienates us from our work, and it alienates us from ourselves, and it alienates us from others. And in doing so, it continually degrades us. And whether that's the sort of market capitalism of the United States or the state capitalism of the former Soviet Union or today China, that these people would say, if you look at China and you think that's socialism, I don't know what to tell you.
Right.
Because I don't believe that.
Because based on what I interpret Marx to say, this was not socialism.
This is not socialism. It's just not. And I know people can make arguments that it is, but in the Marxist humanist tradition, they wouldn't say that because that's what they said about the Soviet Union too. So alongside Fromm, Kolakowski is my favorite. So Leszak Kolakowski was from Poland, and he left the Soviet Union, essentially kind of was an exile of the Soviet Union for writing material that was becoming increasingly more critical of Stalinism and the sort of authoritarianism of the Soviet Union. He goes to London for a while, and then eventually he settles in the United States and becomes professor at the University of Chicago for many, many years.
Okay.
Kolakowski is one of the he like Fromm, he is a very eloquent writer about Marxism and political theory, but he's also really in tune with the history and the philosophy of religion.
Okay.
And he'll often talk about the ways in which Stalinism became sort of this oppressive religion of its own and dogmatism. And that leads us into the first essay of the book, which is a wonderful essay. And I think, when we talk about skeptical leftists, right, this first essay is a really great encapsulation of what we're trying to get across. So the essay is called The Priest and the Jester. And he sort of talks about how, we talk about how socialism in and of itself is kind of a form of eschatology. And eschatology is just a long, fancy word for sort of the end of the world, or sort of the end of the world as we know it, right?
Okay.
To quote the REM song. And that, so he writes about how, so he writes this secular eschatology, this belief in the future elimination of the disparity between man's essence, who he is, and his existence, and the deification of man presupposes obviously that essence is a value and that realization is desirable and that the wisdom of history will bring about this realization. So when he's talking about that, it's basically like that the goal is to resolve the contradiction between the essence of man and the existence of man, that the difference between having and being. And what that means practically is that the elimination of want, the elimination of poverty, disease, suffering, that we create finally a final culmination which will lead to the new society, the new city, right? The new polis. Okay. And that is a worthy thing to value, but it's also a thing to be critical of. Because when you are so doggedly determined to follow a form of secular eschatology, you are essentially becoming what Eric Hoffer would have called the true believer. You're somebody who is completely dogmatic. You are 100% into the cause, and anything that deviates from the cause of the final goal should be eliminated. And so that is kind of the trouble with that sort of eschatological thinking.
Right.
And so it's important for us to note that we have to be critical of those kinds of things. And that gets us into why the essay is called The Priest and the Jester. So Kolakowski is really great at sort of creating these archetypes to help explain concepts. He does this in another part of the book where he describes the clerk and the anti-clerk. Okay. But the priest and the jester are essentially, if you were to use different words, the priest is the dogmatist, the true believer. And the jester is the skeptic, the free thinker, the one who is individual, who is challenging established norms, right? And so what he writes about in the essay is he says, the antagonism between a philosophy that perpetuates the absolute, the priest, and a philosophy that questions accepted absolutes, the jester, seems incurable as that which exists between conservatism and radicalism in all aspects of human life. This is the antagonism between the priest and the jester. And in almost every epoch, the philosophy of the priest and the philosophy of the jester are the two most general forms of intellectual culture. I think this is right. So the priest is the conservative. It's the reactionary, the dogmatist, right? The one who will maintain the status quo. The jester is the iconoclast, the free thinker, the skeptic, the one who questions things, the one who challenges accepted norms, the political radical. We on the left, we're all jesters. Right. None of us are priests, or at least none of us should be priests, that we should be open to challenging accepted norms about how things are. And so, as he further writes, the priest is the guardian of the absolute. He sustains the cult of the final and the obvious, as acknowledged by and contained in tradition. The jester is he who moves in good society without belonging to it, and treats it with impertinence, he who doubts all that appears self-evident. He cannot do this if he belonged to good society. He would then be at best a salon scandalmonger. So basically just kind of like a charlatan. The jester must stand outside good society and observe it from the sidelines in order to unveil the non-obvious behind the obvious, the non-final behind the final. Yet he must frequent society so as to know what it holds secret and to have the opportunity to address it impertinently. So that's our goal, right? That's our goal on the left, is to be the jester. It's to be the one who challenges accepted norms, that asks those basic questions, that challenges power. Because that's ultimately what it comes down to. Yeah. That the left is that which challenges established power and established tradition, or the establishment in general. But at the same time is one who understands the way that societies work, that we are of society, we are from society, but we're not necessarily always of it, that we kind of can sort of take a step back and say, and maybe look at that from a different angle and show people the non-final in the final, right? The non-absolute in the absolute. Yeah. And I love that. I think that's the message of what I think we're trying to do here. And I think the message of the show is to be the jester, is to be the one who challenges the accepted values of the society and makes people question deeply their
Sure.
preconceived notions and deeply held values. And we should do that within ourselves, that we're constantly doing that within ourselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, even when like, you think about like, left philosophies that we believe in or adhere to some degree, we should still be able to criticize them and analyze them questioningly rather than just sticking to whatever a book says.
Right. Because there may be situations where we have to stand on principle, right?
Right.
And we might be in the position of the priest where we're actually standing on a principle on something, that maybe certain things that in questioning them or challenging them, you were actually upholding power.
Right.
So like, this is what it means by like, when he says like, you have to understand the good society in order to criticize it. Like, you have to know what's worthwhile to know what's not.
Yep.
So I don't, like, for example, like TERFs, right? Like,
Right.
I don't think of TERFs as jesters, right? Like, there are people who parade themselves around as like challengers of established norms, when in reality, what they're actually doing is just reinforcing the same hierarchies and the same structures of power.
Yeah, upholding the status quo, but under a different name or whatever.
Yeah. And conservatism is very, very good at absorbing the iconography and the terminology of the left.
Mm-hmm.
So that, another essay in this book that I love is an essay called The Concept of the Left. Like, this is one of the essays that really, like, because people ask, like, what does the left mean? What does it mean to be on the left? What does it mean to be a leftist? That's a really good question,
It
right?
is.
And Kolakowski gives his answer, which is that, we on the left are in the position to act as a negation against the system as it exists. The we exist as a constant reminder to the status quo that they're not good enough. Like, that's what we're supposed to do. So he says, in the essay, The Concept of the Left, he says, to construct a utopia, because it's about believing in utopias, right? Like when it kind of reminds me of, so I know that like Lenin once said, like, we are not utopians, but like everybody kind of is. Like,
right. Then what the fuck are you doing?
Then what the fuck are you doing, right? Like, we all have this idea in our head of like what the good society is, right?
Yeah.
So to construct a utopia, this is Kolakowski now, to construct a utopia is always an act of negation toward an existing reality, a desire to transform it. But negation is not the opposite of construction.
Right.
It is only the opposite of affirming existing conditions.
It sounds similar to stuff I've heard from other, like when talking to people about Murray Bookchin or like other different types of writers. It's like, yeah, utopia isn't necessarily like it isn't like a nothing. It's necessarily like an ideal in many ways.
Right. And we're all striving towards an ideal. It's a normative ideal, right? Because politics is a normative exercise. It's prescriptive, not descriptive. It's what we want to be, not what we are. And so when he talks about the opposite of blowing up a house is not to build a new house, but to retain the existing one. And so so he talks about how the left, and this is the unchangeable and indispensable quality, though by no means it's only one, is a movement of negation toward the existent world. For this very reason, it is, as we have seen, a constructive force. So this is the idea of the negation of the negation. This gets into Hegel, right? So you have the affirmation, you have the negation, and then you have the negation of the negation. And the negation of the negation isn't necessarily its opposite. It's something completely different.
Right.
So this is why the left rejects the objection that its program is only a negative and not a constructive one. A left without a
Yeah, like we have to criticize the status quo and at the same time build our own society, and it's got to be both, and we have to be able to it's got to be all of it.
Right. And so he just kind of hits the nail on the head here where he says a left without a constructive program cannot by that token have a negative one, since these two terms are synonymous. If there is no program, there is at the same time no negation. That is no opposite the left. In other words, conservatism. So if all you're doing is criticizing the system without actually sharing a vision of what we could do, then in essence, you're doing kind of nothing more than, weirdly enough, kind of reaffirming the system, right?
Yeah.
It's when you look at all these different little problems, and then when you realize they're actually one big problem, the big problem is capitalism. Or it's like, oh man, things are horrible, but I don't really know what to do. So sorry.
I'm looking at you again, nihilist anarchists.
Right.
Sorry.
Exactly. Like it's like Kolakowski's philosophy, the humanist tradition in general is fundamentally anti-nihilist. It's humanism at its core, not even just the Marxist part, but the humanist component, the humanist worldview is seeing the worth and value and dignity of every human being and their capacity for self-fulfillment. That's what humanism is. And so we can see how both the degradations of capitalism and the degradations of authoritarian socialism essentially create the same problems in different forms.
Right.
Whether the factory is owned by the state or not doesn't necessarily mean that it will no longer be exploitative.
Right.
So, and this is a point that Fromm makes in his essay on Marx, is that he kind of says, like, for the Marxist humanist, there generally is no discernible difference between the sort of capitalist-owned factory that's exploiting and alienating its workforce through the desire of profit, and the Soviet-owned workplace that is essentially all into the glory of the state and rather than the fulfillment of its people.
Right.
And so, like, that's, I think, a really big issue. A big point is that we should not be comfortable with any of how things are, and constantly challenge even not just how they are, but like our possibilities of what they could be. And so, like, he also like mentioned somewhere else the idea of the left being continually redefined, so that it never necessarily it never gets to a place where it's just at where it wants to be. It's sort of anti-eschatological in the sense, like, we don't have like an endpoint. Like, we're constantly trying to improve exactly where we are. So let's say we get to the world where we do have socialism. We have real socialism. Is that going to negate the problems that our human race is going to have? No, not all of them. It's going to alleviate a lot of them. It's not going to alleviate them all.
We're still going to have to work on things.
We're still going to have to work on things, which is why Marx and Engels make the point in their earlier writings that, like, the conditions of socialism create for humanity the beginning of history. That, like, we finally get to we're no longer shackled by the chains of circumstance that we were before. And so that's why I feel like it's really important to think about how we should constantly reconsider what the left really is, and what we want it to be. And what's funny is, we were talking about nihilism. I literally wrote in the margins over on one of these pages, the left is not nihilistic. So he says, love of martyrdom and heroics is as alien to the left as opportunism in a current situation or renunciation of utopian goals. The left protects against the existing world, but it does not long for a void. It is an explosive charge that disrupts the stability of social life, but it is not a movement toward nothingness.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that, so it's just this idea of the left has to be it's taking on two things at the same time. One, it's taking on the political right, which we are all, that's what we are the negation of. We exist as the negation of the right.
Yeah.
And the right are the defenders of hierarchy, the defenders of patriarchy, the defenders of authority and power. Right? But at the same time, we're also challenging the ways in which the left itself can become hierarchical. Yeah. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah, it's very important. Like, even within our own organizations, that we don't perpetuate racism or sexism in, our own groups. And unfortunately it does happen a lot, but we have to be vigilant against that.
Exactly. There's another key point that he makes that I really find interesting, and it's actually something that Bhaskar Sankara has written about and talked about too, founder of Jacobin, is that the political right, weirdly enough, kind of doesn't believe in anything. So, like, because you'd think, wow, well, they believe in all kinds of things, but not really. And Kolakowski makes the point that the political right generally only have tactics. They don't really have beliefs.
Yeah.
Because their belief is really just the maintenance of the status quo.
Yeah. Yeah. And in whatever way that like might manifest, right? Like I was thinking about that today with like, because you think about, well, how do we appeal to these people? You appeal to people's values, right? But on many levels, like some of the far right just doesn't have values, and they will betray their own values as soon as the moment comes when they have to, justify themselves, their actions or whatever, right?
Exactly. So he writes here about that. He says, "Let us speak openly. Contempt for ideology is the strength of the right because it allows for greater flexibility in practice and for the arbitrary use of any verbal facade that will facilitate the seizure of power."
Yeah.
So they really are all tactics, right? Yeah. That's why the right tend to be better at the short-term game of politics, because they don't give a shit about anything other than power. It
just makes me think of like the Sartre quote about how the anti-Semite doesn't have to be responsible with language or words.
Right.
Like it's Tucker Carlson talking out his ass about whatever the same fucking thing, whatever he wants, and then next week talking about the opposite. Because it doesn't matter.
Right. And like Tucker is like a perfect example. I'm glad you brought him up of what Kolakowski's writing about here. So think about Tucker Carlson as a political commentator. This guy has been in my radar for 20 years. Unfortunately. And I remember him as the bow tie wearing guy that Jon Stewart called a dick.
Yeah.
And back in the people forget that like how he got to sort of prominence was during the 1990s and the welfare reform fight, where Bill Clinton, his whole thing was like, we're going to end welfare as we know it. And we moved away from having aid to dependent families and children to TANF, which is what we have today, and the way that the welfare structure is structured in the United States. Which is awful. I mean, it was not great before, and it's horrible now, and it's been that way for about 25 years, almost going on 30. And he was sort of a late-minute scheduled guest on a television show where he got to sort of trot out his racist ideas about how, like, get the welfare queens off, kind of channeling Reagan there, and that's kind of how he came to prominence, was this like guy who would go on TV in a bow tie and a smart shirt and like say these deeply contemptible things. And in that regard, he's actually, the right is like that in general. Like that's their whole thing, right? Yeah. Like whether it's Candace Owens or Ben Shapiro or whoever.
It became too successful for like the base, right? So then they all do that.
And so, Tucker went from being this like country club sort of garden variety racist to then becoming like this like indefatigable defender of the war in Iraq and President Bush.
Yeah.
And that didn't really go anywhere. And then sort of starting to become like more of like a Pat Buchanan type, but on MSNBC. And then that kind of didn't go anywhere because people forget Tucker Carlson had a show on MSNBC like twice. And then he got to Fox News, and it was sort of kismet, because then it was a couple of things happened at the same time. One was he kind of figured out what he was going to do, which was the sort of right populism, which is completely different than he was, 20 years ago during the war in Iraq, where he was sort of your typical sort of neoconservative, and, didn't find a war he didn't like, right?
Right.
Where now he's like more critical of war, but it's in service of sort of isolationism and nativism. And so there was the sort of changing of the rhetoric, and then Bill O'Reilly basically getting Me Too'd and being thrown off Fox News.
Right.
So, because Tucker got his time slot.
Yeah.
And so that, like those two things happening gave Tucker finally, after 20 years of trying, success. Like he finally had bona fide success.
Yeah.
And it was doing it as this like right populist and the fact that anybody buys it is mind blowing to me. But it's the power of, as you said, like quoting Sartre, like you don't have to be discerning in your language.
Yeah.
When you can just say whatever the hell you want, you can get away with quite a bit.
When the truth doesn't matter, then whatever.
When the truth doesn't matter and you have no scruples and you don't really care about the morality of it, you can kind of say whatever. And this is where I think we as the left have to acknowledge that, like, that's one of our weaknesses, is that we actually do have beliefs.
We care about the facts. We care about reality.
We care about the facts. We care about reality. And we care about morality.
Unfortunate, but we do.
We care about what's right. And sometimes what's right isn't always what's popular.
Right.
You know? And
exactly.
So we're constantly fighting this like headlong fight where we're always butting up against. And that's what we should do as the left. We're constantly butting up against established systems of power and challenging them. Right. And so like as the society becomes more and more, tolerant. Right. So like, for example, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, we were talking more about marriage equality and gay people and we were talking more about that. Now it's trans folks, because we've moved as a society where in some respects we've kind of gained a certain level of, social acceptance in a good way. Right. Yeah. So now we're fighting the new fight, which is for trans folks. Which were always there. That was always a thing that we should have cared about. But now that the space has sort of opened up more because of our successes, in some respects, that will open it up for other things. Which is why, like, he also makes the point of saying, like, never sell utopia short. So, like, that's why we argue for the most, like, sometimes it's best to argue for the most hardline position. Because if you're going to have to do a compromise in a system, it's better to make the hardline position and get a compromise that's really good than starting with the sort of compromised position and then getting something even worse, which is what Democrats generally do. Right? So like,
that's what all politicians do. So
right, like Medicare for all, right, is a very it's my good example of this, where it's like it's very clear, it's very open about exactly what we want to do, but you could take that even further, which is a fully public healthcare system, because Medicare is just like having health insurance, right? So the hospitals can still be private, the doctors can still be private, the medical industries can still be private. So sometimes you can even take it further, which is the decommodification. Like that's the more radical version, like decommodification and re-socialization, where we truly make it a socialist or democratically controlled and owned means of production on certain things. So Medicare for all really is kind of, but 10 years ago, 20 years ago, Medicare for all wasn't really even on the radar.
Right.
But that was the most radical position. Well, now Medicare for all is in some respects kind of the compromise position. So now we can go even further, right? This is why prison abolition is, I think, a great point.
Right.
It's exactly what Kolakowski's getting at, which is that you start with the most, radical, profound position, so that you can
police, no prisons.
Yeah, that's no police, no prisons. What we want. Yes, right. So and so then if you then, for the sake of giving people means that will actually make their lives better in the immediate, maybe we do a compromise, but that compromise is much better than what would have been if we had been more half-assed about it.
Yeah.
Which is why, he and Ernst Bloch and others is like, don't give up the possibility of utopia. Like utopia is the goal, and so, and acknowledge that we may never get there, That's why it's utopia.
We're working for it.
We're working for it. Utopia is literally no place, right? So it's
got a comment from
some random geek. I had several arguments to liberals about abolishing ERG. Right. Because their mindset is they're not there yet, right? And so like it's really hard to make that argument. And the way that I try to make it is by saying, we keep throwing good money after bad on this.
Yeah.
We keep trying to give money, if it's kind of like, if we build more lanes on the highway, it will reduce traffic. And it never does, right? Because of induced demand. Yeah. Because more cars will just be on the fucking road, right? if you give cops more money and you give them more guns, they'll just use it the same way they did before, only more so.
Yeah.
And also sucks from liberals. Yeah, this world sucks, but it is the world we live in. I'm a realist. Ooh, good. I'm glad you brought that up. So that's really good. Hold on, because that's a very good point. So it's like, let's see, because he mentioned something like that in the chapter on the concept of the left, is that the revolutionary movement is a catch-all for the ultimate demands made upon existing society. It is a total negation of the existing system and therefore also a total program. A total program is, in fact, utopia. A utopia is a necessary component of the revolutionary left, and the latter is a necessary product of the social left as a whole. Like, I think that's right,
Yeah.
The right strives to idealize actual conditions, not to change them. What it needs is fraud, not utopia. Society cannot be divided into a right and a left. A leftist attitude toward one movement can be linked with a rightist attitude toward another. It is only in their relative meanings that these words make sense. And that's like the Overton window part.
Right.
But yeah, he sort of talks about like, well, you're just trying to be a realist or whatever. And, there's an essay later on in the book that's called Responsibility in History. And it's like a longer essay. It's like the bulk of the book. It's made up of 4 shorter essays. But he talks about the escapist conspiracy. And this is, I think, the difference, as like we are utopians and we may have ideals, but we're not necessarily idealists, because idealists are ones who are predicated on no action. It's the sort of liberal impulse, right? To believe in something, to sort of witness suffering, but not to really do anything about it. Which is generally kind of the difference, like when we think of, he's just being idealistic. Like that's kind of like an ML thing, right? Or people Marxists who criticize non-Marxists as being everybody's idealist. Well, that's just a cheap word you can throw around to not actually interrogate what other people are saying to you.
Right.
And so this is where we get into the idea of the clerk and the anti-clerk. So the all-out escapist or the clerk is, somebody who is, disguised as a guardian of universal human values, a costume lined with cowardice and hypocrisy. The clerk in reality longs to protect purely personal private values that matter to no one but himself, right? So that's what really the idealistic or the escapist is somebody who just kind of gives up. There's a certain level of nihilism in that too, right? So when people say, well, this is the best it's going to be, I'm being realistic here. But are you being realistic here? Because in reality, what you're doing is you're accepting a social system as it is, and accepting that it is the best it will be, which in and of effect is an ideal.
Yeah.
So when you're saying, well, I'm just trying to be realistic, well, no, actually, you're being idealistic as anybody else is, but your idealistic version of something is a far narrower possibility than what we seek to do. And I think that, and the anti-clerk is in some respects, the anti-clerk is also in a sense the realist. So you have the escapist and the realist. The anti-clerk views the world from the vantage point of existence as distinct from the clerk, who sees it in terms of what it ought to be, in terms of a fiction he himself has created and sought unsuccessfully to impose upon reality. In the confrontation, the escapist is on contact with the real world, totally compromised by the feat of his ought. So, the realist is also in and of itself, these are both versions that are both problematic. So the escapist is someone who's just sort of falling into whatever their idea in their head, but not actually trying to realize it. And the realist is sort of realizing whatever they have, but is never challenging not challenging the system and seeing it as it could be. So the real balance is trying to strike a balance between the two. And the way you do that is by having reason and independence. So this is a great quote. And I think this sums up a lot of like the attitude of Kolakowski's ideas and kind of our show too, which is, he says, man's decadence begins whenever that most human feature, rational understanding, becomes depraved in the service of national myths, emotions, and hatreds. An individual actively engaged in political conflicts can never attain the intellectual perspective that enables him to perceive the limitations of his own camp and the irrationality of undertakings in which he participates. So it's important, like this goes back, we were talking about either about the true believer, right? Like political action is an evangelical exercise, as Adam Johnson calls it. And it is, right? Like we are evangelists for a certain cause. The difference between us, in a sense we are, right? Like we're trying to sort of preach a new form of gospel, right? Yeah. This is where it's really hard to escape the language of religion, despite how much we might want to. And so that we have to make sure that in the desire for building a better world, that we do not lose our capacity for reason, and we don't lose our own humanity in the process. Yeah. You know, so this is where you'll hear like, well, you know, there were so many, you know, it's like, oh, well, there were so many people lifted out of poverty and a certain system. I'm like, yeah, but there were millions who were eviscerated by that same system.
Yeah.
So you can't really like make the argument that like, oh, well, everything got so much better. Well, yeah, but for only certain people, right?
Right. Yeah. Like, it's hard once you get into a certain rigid mode of thinking, and then that you can suddenly dismiss like, you know, even a couple extra deaths, right? Like if you can just dismiss that sort of thing, it becomes pretty problematic. But
exactly. Yeah. And so like when we talk about like the clerkism is essentially like his stand-in for Stalinism. This is like his essay where he's sort of critiquing Stalinism as opposed to real revolutionary socialism or leftism.
Yeah.
And so he says clerkism is the defeat of political choice, a flight from commitment that rationalizes itself as a defense of super-historical values, when in actual fact it shows the impossibility of finding values in current history. The whole complex of recent political and intellectual attempts at the ideological renaissance of the revolutionary left, this is where he's talking about also in Poland, because he's writing about conditions in Poland in the 1950s and 60s, you know, which Poland after World War II was essentially taken over by the Soviet Union and became part of the Eastern Bloc, and would be a part of the Eastern Bloc for essentially 40 years until the Solidarity movement in the late 1980s and the political independence of Poland. The whole complex of recent political and intellectual attempts at the ideological renaissance of the revolutionary left, attempts whose effects and effectiveness cannot be foreseen at present, must be characterized generally as an attempt to break through the traditional Stalinist blackmail of a single alternative in political life. He is a humanist burdened with all the traditions of humanism, which he does not want to discard. And like, that's what we're talking about, where, you know, it's so important to have a healthy balance between, you know, the capacity for utopia and the desirability of the here and now in the sense that we're trying to fight for a better world and not sort of losing ourselves in the process of trying to make it.
Right.
And that's always the trouble of, I think, any political movement, is that you want to try to keep your humanity in the sort of maelstrom of political activity. So yeah, I mean, I think that when it comes to, you know, so kind of writing further about sort of sects and sectarianism, he writes, unflagging vigilance over its own meticulous boundary lines is an essential characteristic of every social group that can be called a sect. Constant control to assure precise and unambiguous criteria, differentiating it from the entire outside world. So if your goal is to create a sect which is so meticulously created that's separate from the world, how do you seek to change the world if you're no longer kind of a part of it? Right? This goes back to the Jester idea of being of the world, but not necessarily from it, where you're coming in, you're being a part of the world, you're critical of it, but it's in service of trying to make the world better.
Right.
Rather than sort of this separate world where you are then sort of satisfied by your own pretentious, you know, isolation, right? And a much cruder way of saying it, you kind of start enjoying the smell of your own farts. Like your head's so far up your own ass that you can't really see anything else. And he writes of Stalinism in this way, where he says, what Stalinism implies in the life of communist parties is not that they are so badly organized that they do not allow for the control of the party masses over the authorities. It means that the social function of the party is to render impossible a change in this type of organization. So, like, when we think of Stalinism, it became a very rigid, archaic system. It became very ideologically and strategically kind of moribund. It was just not. It became very rigid, and in doing so, it sort of limited its capacities for change, which is how it then became, in its own perverted form, politically right instead of actually being political left. And so when you ban opposition parties, when you ban voices of dissent, when you shut down points of view that challenge you, that's when you become part of that whole, essentially.
Yeah, when you start banishing like former allies because they disagree with you on something, that's not a good sign.
Exactly.
It's a bad way to run things.
And so he talks about, we can get into the whole no true Scotsman fallacy, and that's a true thing.
Sure.
This is what he writes about the true socialist.
Right.
The true socialist acts at the risk of losing, sometimes even with the certainty of losing, and the greater the probability of defeat, the higher the moral value of his deed. The duty to fight for socialism has no motivation other than the fact that it is a duty, which means that socialism is realized as a value of the individual's moral effort. Those who think that socialism is as inevitable in the future as an eclipse of the sun scheduled for tomorrow can find nothing to lend moral worth to deeds performed with an absolute certainty of success. So when you separate progress solely from moral concerns, where it's like, and that's kind of what Stalinism does, and he kind of writes about that in his essay, where he talks, and this other component of this larger essay is Stalinism seeing social progress as a moral duty. But the problem is that social progress is a very sort of nebulous concept. So then what does that actually mean for you? And so if we wish, as he says, if we wish to avoid the obvious trap of reasoning in circles, we must choose one of the two concepts, either social progress or moral values, as logically prior to the other. So it's like, it's much better to go with moral values first and then build upon social progress. Because if all you're doing is social progress because social progress can mean more people are eating, or it can mean that like more people live in houses, and all those are very, very good things, right?
Right.
But within a system as brutal as Stalinism was, that also meant like the jailing of political prisoners and people being in gulags and a lot of human misery for a lot of other people. So they were sort of, as Noam Chomsky would call it, they're sort of worthy and unworthy victims, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So they were worthy, or worthy or unworthy people. So they were worthy people because they matched our view of social progress as a moral good. And there were those who did not match our moral value of social progress as a good. So anybody who sort of fit outside of that system was no longer considered an important component of it. And I think that that's really the challenge. So we as socialists and on the left broadly, we have to essentially choose a moral path first. What do we want to seek? And that's the sense of utopia, like the building of the better city, the better society, trying to alleviate hierarchies and exploitation and alienation, and leaving the space for people to truly live out their lives as they want to be, right? Like that's the goal. And then you build on that from there.
Yeah.
So, because if you only do social progress first, it becomes much more nebulous.
Yeah. I guess it becomes one of those things like when you think about the quote unquote revolution, right? And you think like, okay, well, how many people will be harmed in this change, this social change, or potentially violent change? And is that like, you have to be able to like look at this and question, is this effect part of what I actually want? Like, is it working towards the society that I want at the risk of my moral values?
Right. And so ultimately in this larger section, he talks about how Marx sort of served as the bridge between utopianism and realism. He is the kind of middle, he's not like the middle ground, but he's kind of the synthesis of the two, right?
Okay.
So he says Marx was the man who sought to build a bridge between the two cliffs, meaning realism and utopianism. And on this bridge, utopian socialism was essentially to be overcome. The two men, so it's essentially the difficulty of the job is not the ordinary one of discussing a theoretical problem by which not yet found a sufficiently well-based answer, but which may arrive at it someday when the issue will be settled once and for all. Well, that's actually, sorry. But long story short, like Marx sort of saw himself as, and sort of tried to have that balance between the two. This is where you get the idea of like scientific socialism or whatever. And
right.
I don't necessarily think that term is like the worst thing ever, because I read it as like a 19th century version of science, which is just much more like rational and empirical observations of phenomena and trying to, but politics at the end of the day is still a normative project. It's still about what society you want to build.
I get stuck with this sort of thing with just people in general, because whether we like it or not, and maybe this is my Damien influencing me, but whether we like it or not, our values are the root of where we are. Like that everything comes from that. I didn't become an anarchist and then develop the values that I have. I developed the values that I have, and then I looked at the world, and anarchism seemed to fit them best. Right? Like
exactly. Like it's like, as Matt Dillahunty says, my atheism was a result of my skepticism. Like where certain conclusions we reach precisely because we have certain morals.
I believe in liberation. Like so that leads me to be on the left. That leads me to
and that leads to a form of social progress. And that's what Kolakowski would have argued too, is that like if all you care about is ends, there will only be means. And if you only care about means, there will only be ends. In the sense that if your obsession with the end point blinds you from what you need to do in the immediate term to maybe even get there.
Mm-hmm.
And then if all you care about is means, then you don't really have an underlying end that you're seeking towards.
Right.
You're not, there's nothing you're actually fighting for, right? This is the sort of Vox view of the world, right? The sort of neoliberal view of the world is all about means and not ends.
Right.
Because the neoliberal impulse is basically to say, this is the best the world's ever going to be, and it's not really going to get much dramatically better, but we can kind of pick at the margins. And the way we pick at the margins is, if all you care about means, you are the Democratic Party. That's right. That's right. And that's why I said sort of the Vox view of the world, right? The sort of, if the Ezra Kleins of the world, that sort of centrist neoliberal sort of corporate Democrat world, that all you care about is, if we change this tax program here, we do this, that, and the other. And it's like, yeah, she might actually like help some people, but you're sort of in your overzealous desire to sort of tweak things, you kind of lose sight of, what's the point of all of it to begin with? What are you actually trying to achieve? Like, what do you want?
It often makes me think of like, because anarchists talk about the synchronizing ends and means. That's the whole game, right? You cannot build the world you want by using means contradictory to that ends. So like, if we want this is why we're against the state, right? If we want a free liberatory society if we want communism, which is classless, stateless, moneyless society, we cannot do it by using the state, is essentially part of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that, when we talk about the desire to really build a better world, like that's why I always say that that politics is a normative enterprise. Like we are making a moral argument.
Yeah.
So like, this is something that drives me crazy when people say that like, we shouldn't legislate morality, but that's what legislation is.
That's literally, yeah. Like
what else literally what it is. What else legislation is morality. Like,
bunch of abstract things that nobody gives a shit about.
You know, and like people can make the argument that there's no moral reason to have a speed limit, but I would say actually there is, because the reason that you would have a lower speed limit in some places is so that if you hit a child, you don't kill them.
Well, speed limits are a product of safety necessity.
They are a product of safety. It all goes back to a moral impulse.
Yeah.
You know, that's where Kolakowski was, and that's where I know Damien is an axiological atheist, right? You go back to certain axiomatic, foundational, positions, and then you build on that from there. And like, I agree with that. Like, I think like I'm with you. I want to live in a world where, where again, it's the humanist view, which is that I want to build a world that allows for the free and open development of all. That's what I want.
Yeah.
And when I talk about the free and open society, what I'm talking about is not like libertarian, like right libertarian shit.
Right.
What I mean by the free and open society is one where people's needs are met, and so that it provides them with the space to find out who they really are.
Yeah. Because
so many of us, and pretty much any of us who are a product of capitalism, right? We suffer from exploitation. We suffer from alienation. We suffer from some forms of degradation. And ultimately, it goes back to what we really want, which is liberation. I didn't mean to sound like Cornel West there.
We
or
live
Jesse
our
Jackson.
lives through coercion and force.
Yes. Yes. And that's why, like, the libertarian idea of, well, it's just a free, open contract. Like, no, it's not. Like, if I don't work, I don't eat. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, if I don't work, I don't get to have a house. If I don't work, I don't have the medicines that keep me alive. Like, I have to do that.
Yeah.
It is quite compulsive. Like, it's a compulsory system. And so, because I believe in the supreme worth of individuals as well as humanity as a whole, like, I don't see humanity as like an illness or a virus or a scourge. That kind of language is the language of fascists.
Yeah, that's right.
And even if people who use it not necessarily are fascists, it's the language of fascists. The seeing humanity as like a plague. It's like, no, it's not. Like, and so it's either we have to fight the sort of impulses of the status quo, but at the same time, we have to fight the impulses of nihilism, of apathy, and of, sort of, maladapted modes of thinking that sort of leave people with very little left to really give them a reason to live. Like if all you're doing is just like the doomerism of it, right? So it's like, well, everything's just going to go to shit. Why do I care or whatever? And it's like, I care because I find it to be morally right to care.
Yeah.
Like I see that as a moral virtue in and of itself to care, right? And I find not caring is a moral vice. And so like I act from the impulse of caring is important. So it's because the only way change ever happens is by people who actually do care.
That's right. Yeah.
And so if you're only in it for the glory, or you're only in it for the sort of prestige, or you're only in it for the means, like, then you're not really in it. Like, you're not really interested in the left project.
Yeah.
Because it is about liberation. It's about liberation from artificial barriers that we have put against ourselves and others.
Yep.
That's the goal. Like, that's the whole point. That's why socialism at its core, or the left at its core, is a humanistic project.
Yeah.
We actually like humanity.
Yeah.
Conservatives hate humanity. They hate us. They hate humans. They hate themselves. It's a philosophy built upon either no values at all, or only really one, which is hatred.
Yeah.
They're fueled solely by hatred. And a philosophy that's built solely upon hatred is one that will ultimately destroy others and will destroy yourself, which is the Stalinist project was built upon hate, right? We have to hate the revisionist, or we have to hate the Trotskyist, or we have to hate the kulaks. We have to hate these other people, right? Yeah. It's the George Orwell thing, the 10 minutes hate, right? It's that idea of we have to find someone to hate, and in finding someone to hate, we don't have to actually deal with the real problems, because that's the conservative impulse, right? Today it's like, well, we're going to blame the immigrants, we're going to blame trans people, or we're going to hate so and so. Hatred is the fuel by which conservatism sort of continues on, because it's all they've got. You know, they only have hatred. So, you know, we have to be hopeful. We have to be kind. But not naive.
Right.
Not easily, not pushovers. We should fight when it counts. We should also be mean when it counts, in the sense that some people deserve it.
Yep.
And it's not necessarily out of hate, but out of justice.
Yeah.
That's the goal, right? And so it's about understanding the notion of justice and liberation, how those two go together, because we don't live under a just system. We just don't.
Right.
And we face injustice every single day in all of our lives. No matter how comfortable we may be, we all face it.
Yeah.
So the impulse to just sort of go, well, this is about as good as it's going to be. That's the impulse you have to fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
that's exactly the impulse that makes everybody like they say, oh yeah, well, it's not going to change. We can't trust any politicians, but I'm just going to vote for this guy all the time anyway. Never criticize him.
And I think I want to end with the last essay, because we're certainly not going to cover everything, because even though this book is only like 220 pages, it's just got so much in it. It covers a lot of ground. But the last essay is called In Praise of Inconsistency, which I really like this last essay, because it gets into what is a consistent person? Like, what does that mean to be a consistent person? So he writes about how, therefore I consider a consistent man to be simply one who, possessing a certain number of general absolute concepts, strives earnestly in all he does, and in all his opinions about what should be done, to remain in the fullest possible accord with those concepts, right? This is essentially like the full absolutist consistent person is the conservative person. It's the person who is not willing to change their values based upon new information or different circumstances. A humanist is someone who will be inconsistent.
Right. Because you have to adapt. Right?
Because you have to adapt. And so when we talk about, he talks basically humanity has survived only thanks to inconsistency. Like, we've changed all the time, right? Yeah. Like, if Galileo didn't challenge, this is the example he uses in the essay, if Galileo didn't challenge the church on the heliocentric, the Earth-centered theory of the universe, then we wouldn't have progressed, right? Science is, inconsistency is science is a feature, not a bug.
Right.
And so when we think about inconsistency, like on the surface, we go, that person's a flip-flopper, or they changed their mind.
Right.
Like, I want people to change their mind.
I want you to change your mind based on the evidence.
If I stayed the exact same way politically at 32 years old that I was at 18 or 22 or 24 or whatever, I would not be growing as a human being.
Right. Yeah.
And so he talks about how inconsistency as an individual attitude is merely a consciously sustained reserve of uncertainty, a permanent feeling of possible personal error, or if not that, then of the possibility that one's antagonist is right.
Okay. And you have to have that, right? You have to have that level of awareness that it's possible that this thing that I am saying is wrong, even though sometimes it's really hard to admit that. It's hard to do it. But
Right. But here's where he ends the essay. He beautifully. Oh, some random geek has a comment. When I am presented with new evidences, I change my position. What do you do with new information?
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Right. Like, you change with what you learn. Right. And so I'm not the same person today that I was a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And anybody who would just stay the same their entire lives and is totally consistent all of the time is in and of itself conservative. It's not, it's dogmatic, right? and here's where the inconsistency is great, right? Where it's the whole like everything in moderation, even moderation. So he gets even into that. So he talks about how, for let us also carefully bear in mind that to be consistent in inconsistency means to contradict by an act the application of a certain consistency, something the affirmation of which, the affirmation of inconsistency, is the substance of that act. In short, to fall into an impossible situation, into an antimony. So like antimony. So like, that's a lot of words there. But basically what he's saying is that if you're inconsistent all of the time, then you're being consistently inconsistent, which is a form of consistency itself, right?
Right.
So like if you don't, like if you're like, well, you know, I'm going to change my mind based on the evidence, but I'm going to change my mind back or whatever.
Right. Every time I get new evidence, I'm going to change my mind again. Therefore,
I'm going to change my mind again instead of maybe the evidence either like clarifies a point of view.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily completely overturn it. Right.
Yeah.
So like new information doesn't always overturn our view of the world. Sometimes it either solidifies what we know, and makes us more confident in it, in which case that's a form of inconsistency itself when you go from being more soft in a position to harder, a little bit more harder in a position. So he says, you know, let us therefore also be consistent in our inconsistency and apply the principle to inconsistency of itself. So, right. So it's everything in moderation, including moderation, you know, it's good to be inconsistent, even with inconsistency itself. And I love that. I remember getting to the end of the book and seeing the title of that essay and be like, okay, where's he going with this?
Right.
And it's great because it gets to the heart of skepticism and what we as skeptics and humanists are all about, which is that, you know, that changing of our minds based on new information, precisely because, and we're going to go back to Damien here for a second, because we see it as a moral value to change our minds based on new information so that we see being truthful as being good and honorable, right? So like, because truth is that which allows us to understand our world better, and understanding our world better is something that we value, you know? So, because politics is all about values. It's all about values. It's all about morals.
Yeah.
And people,
the whole facts over feelings crowd is often the most led by their feelings. But we all are. Like, that's why we have the political values that we have. It's all,
and we should.
Yeah, that's right.
And we should. As David Hume said, reason ought to be the slave of the passions.
That's right.
What he meant by that was that never let your reason overrule your moral conscience.
Yeah. That's
the point of that, you know? Or as he also said in the Inquiry Concerning Understanding, he also said, you know, let us philosophize, but also be a man. Now that's kind of gendered language, but what he means by that is like, at the end of the day, just be a person. Like, you don't have to be like the philosopher all the time. Like, you know, you can be a human being and like have short-sighted times and ignorances and like make mistakes and have passions. Like, it's okay to do those things because that's part of being human.
Yeah.
Like, this is the thing, like, and I can't help myself because I'm going to talk about Star Trek for a second. So I feel like most people fundamentally misunderstand Spock. This is something that like drives me crazy. So people talk about Spock. Oh, Spock is pure logic. Everything about him is logical. No, it's not. You don't think Spock feels things?
Isn't he part human?
He's half human, right?
Of course he's passionate.
And he comes from a race. The Vulcans, right? Even Vulcans are deeply emotional and passionate creatures.
Just the way they express it is
the way they express it. They maintain their emotions because their emotions are stronger than even humans sometimes.
Yeah.
So the goal is not to just like abandon all of your emotions in the service of logic, you know, because as Spock said in Star Trek VI, logic is the beginning, not the end of wisdom. Mm-hmm. You know, and the whole story of Spock is him learning to embrace the emotional part of him, to embrace the human part of him. That's the whole story. Like, that's the whole point, is for him to embrace every component of who he is. And like, that's what we should do too.
Yeah.
So like when people say, well, thanks over your feelings, like, first off, facts are not value neutral. They've never
That's
been.
right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay? So like your facts are in service of some kind of moral principle.
Yeah.
Like whatever facts you want to trot out, selective or otherwise, they're in service of what you're trying to say, which is generally going to be a moral point. And so we should not be afraid of any of that.
Yeah.
Having feelings and letting those morals and feelings be a part of who we are is being human.
Yep.
It's just as human as rationality. And that rationality and the sort of emotionality is what makes us who we are. You know, humanists are about creating a society where people can become the fully integrated self that they have the potential to become.
Yep.
And that's why the humanist project is something that deeply criticizes authoritarianism wherever it marches, whether it's in capitalism or in state capitalism or whatever, is it's challenging that which degrades human life. And we challenge that wherever it is.
Yep.
The enemy of my enemy is not my friend.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's so I think it's important that we do that. And we recognize that the world is a very fluid and dynamic place. And that in being a fluid and dynamic place, that's what kind of makes it beautiful.
Yeah.
Like if everything was the same all of the time, that would suck. We deal with the struggles so as to know what the victories feel like.
Right.
Like life is a mix of all of those things.
Yeah.
So in general, that's sort of our first sort of foray into talking about Marxist humanism.
Very cool.
I love this book. I'll probably at some point even probably write something longer about it because I think that Kolakowski was brilliant. He also wrote an enormous book, which is like behind me. It's like right there. It's called Main Currents of Marxism. It's actually 3 books. The version I have is 1 book put together.
I think. Kerrigan sent a tweet to me a few days ago about Kolakowski and how he became an anti-Marxist due to his negative experiences with state communist Poland.
Yeah.
And the main currents of Marxism, which is very critical of Marxism in general.
Yes. So this is where we get into the sort of like earlier Kolakowski and like later Kolakowski. So like he never fully abandoned like the socialist project. But basically he became closer to another sort of humanist who came out of Marxism, who then became critical of Marxism, a guy named Sidney Hook.
Okay.
Sidney Hook was also kind of like that too. So like there are other Marxists, like Ralph Miliband has written a whole essay basically saying that like Kolakowski's the worst and whatever. But I think like what Kolakowski does well is explore both the great things about Marxism and what Marxism can be and all of the terrible things about it too. And like all of its limitations, all of its problems, and its sort of degradations as time goes on. So he never like fully abandons it, but he definitely becomes much more
critical,
much more critical as time goes on. And so, yeah.
Okay.
So it's like in general, like my own personal position on Marxism is probably closer to Erich Fromm's than it is to Kolakowski's, because like Fromm pretty much stayed a Marxist his whole life,
right?
Whereas Kolakowski kind of didn't. And he also became like Kolakowski also wrote a lot more about religion as his life went on.
Oh, okay.
More about religion and myth. And so like the early Kolakowski, of which this book is a part of, is a lot closer to the more sort of like skeptical humanist tradition. But he never really abandons his humanism, but he does sort of abandon some of his Marxism. So Kerrigan made a great point. So like I think it's relevant. Nevertheless, I still think that Main Currents of Marxism is a quite impressive book in terms of its historiography of Marxism, because it's all in one place. It's very few books kind of put it all in one place, which is kind of nice.
Oh, cool. Well, I guess what are we covering next time?
So next time we're doing another dual review. So we're talking about. So next time we're going to be talking about 2 books. We're going to be talking about we're going to kind of go back to our roots a little bit, I guess. And we're going to be talking about God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. I'm doing a retrospective review on that book for the Truth Seeker magazine, which will be in the forthcoming issue, the summer issue.
Okay.
I've been asked to because the Truth Seeker is going to be publishing an excerpt of a guy who just wrote a book on Hitchens, and we're going to run an excerpt of his book, and then we're going to run my stuff.
Ah.
And I thought it would be kind of fun after not having read that book in like 10 years, even longer than 10 years.
See how it holds up.
See how it holds up. So, spoiler alert, it holds up a lot better than I thought it would.
Oh, cool.
So
that's good to know. I was prepared to be disappointed.
No, actually, it's. But the other book we're going to be covering is called Reason, Faith, and Revolution. It's by Terry Eagleton.
Okay.
And Terry Eagleton is awesome. I love him. He's a Marxist literary theorist, cultural critic. And his book is basically written in response to Christopher Hitchens and sort of critical of Hitchens.
Okay.
I find there's a lot in both books that I like and both things that I'm critical of, and we'll sort of get into that. But in general, I like both books. Cool. And so I'm working on the Hitchens one now, and I'll probably write another piece that's going to be separate. That'll be about Terry Eagleton's book.
Okay.
And Terry Eagleton's book, he's very similar to Slavoj Žižek in this regard. We haven't covered Žižek yet on the show, but we will. Talking about sort of Christian atheism and what that kind of represents, because that's kind of what Terry Eagleton is, and it's kind of what Žižek is too.
Okay.
And their view on theology is really unique and interesting, and is no way like it's like essentially it comes down to different types of humanism for Terry Eagleton, and he talks about how Hitchens' humanism is different than his, and he sort of explains why.
Okay.
And so that'll be, I think, a good episode, and it'll be fun to talk about. So, yeah, no, that book, I think what makes God is Not Great, I think, hold up better is that he kind of wrote it knowing it was going to be kind of evergreen. So he tried his best not to like infuse it with as much of like what was going on at the time or like current events or like his own like specific politics sometimes. So it's actually a lot more general, I thought, than I remembered. That does not necessarily mean that I love everything about Hitchens. I don't.
Right. Yeah.
So, but yeah. Anyway, I like Eagleton's politics a lot better. He was sort of a keeper of the faith, to use a phrase, when talking about being a socialist. So,
and I guess, where can people find you?
So people can find me at justinclark.org. That's my website. It's where my writing, podcast episodes, my other professional work is all there. You can also find me on Instagram at JustinClarkPH. PH is for public history. And like I said, I'll be having that essay about Hitchens. It'll be in the upcoming essay on the Truth Seeker. And I will keep plugging along on other projects throughout the summer. So, just keep staying tuned, and I'll see you all in a couple weeks. And like I always say, support the Patreon. Corey works very, very hard on this show, and I would love for him, throw him a little coin,
or share the show,
or share the show. That's good too.
Yeah.
If you can't, I know everybody is not necessarily in a position to support financially. That's fine. Give us a like. Share it out on your social media.
That's right.
Especially when Corey cuts up like the 1 or 2 minute clips. Like, I want one of those bad boys to go viral. So like, let's have that happen. So, so anyway, it was a great episode tonight, and I look forward to chatting with you in a couple weeks, man. This was great.
Good. All right, that's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me survive, which is essentially the only way that projects like this can continue for me. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticalleftist. If you can't contribute financially, then a like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check the show notes for links to all my stuff, and to check out my website, skepticalleftist.com. There you can find the videos I do with my friend Damien Marie Athope, and all my old content from the Brainstorm podcast, Skeptarchy, and from my newly retired show, From Many People's Strength. You can also find links to my Discord, Reddit, and Twitch. You can contact me through my website or by emailing mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. My Twitter is @skepticallefty. My Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, and my Mastodon is collectiva.social/@skepticalleftist. Thanks so much for listening and or watching, and make sure to leave a comment on the video or on my website. Join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda.